welcome everybody. What we are going to do today, we're making a little bit of a switch in the program that you have in front of you. We're going to start out giving our student social justice awards, and then Dr. Janine Love is going to make some remarks, and then we will move into our Matthew Freeman lecture. I'm Heather Dalmage. I am the director of the Mansfield Institute, and so happy each year to be able to offer this lecture and the social justice awards in honor of Matthew Freeman, who graduated about 12 years ago. He unfortunately passed before he was able to complete his very last semester. He received an honorary degree, and he was very committed to a life of social justice, and in his honor, we have created this lecture and social justice award. So what I would like to do is begin by talking about the Social Justice Award. We put out a call for nominations every year, and this year, like years past, we received phenomenal nominations from our faculty, staff, and your fellow students. And a committee of 5 of us, June Lapidus, Dr. Lapidus, if you're here, thank you. And then we had 3 students serving on the committee, Katia Martinez, Samantha Martinez, and Vanessa Martinez. I see Vanessa here, yes. We had a requirement. And the committee ranked the nominations, and then we met, and in the end, we had 2 exceptional candidates and could not decide, and so we will be awarding 2 social justice awards this year. So let me start out first, and I am doing this in alphabetical order. To be fair, we really could not make a decision, so this is alphabetical. The first student was nominated by Pamela Thompson-Hill, the director of the Multicultural Student Support Services. She was this student's mentor and advisor for the last 4 years. And the student is Brittany Austin. Make sure I've got the right one. So let me tell you a little bit about Brittany. In her 4 years here, she has worked at 3 jobs while working full-time at Roosevelt University. She serves on the BSU. She's been involved in countless leadership roles across Roosevelt University and in the community, creating open mics around HIV/AIDS awareness. She's done work on the West Side and plans to continue doing work on the West Side. Pamela Thompson-Hill wrote, "Brittany has a strong passion for social, economic, and environmental justice issues, and her current position as BSU president has allowed her to emerge as a leader." When Brittany leaves Roosevelt University, graduates, her plan is to bridge the gap between health disparities in poor communities by building health clinics targeting the west side of Chicago, where she was born, and Milwaukee, where she grew up. So I would like to actually.
I get a chance to do this. Brittany, congratulations. This is wonderful. All right. Brittany is a role model for all of us. All of us. Thank you. Congratulations.
Okay. So she's going to say a few words.
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank the family of Matthew Freeman and Roosevelt University for presenting me with this award. I'm extremely humbled and honored to model what it means to be socially just on Roosevelt's campus. One of my favorite authors, James Baldwin, once said, "Anyone who struggles with poverty knows what it means, knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor." Roosevelt has allowed me to bridge my passion for social justice with my love for science. I have immensely become confident in focusing on the health disparities I've seen within my communities affecting people of color. I hope to continue this as I leave Roosevelt University. Thank you so much.
Okay. And now nominated by professors, plural, in a unified letter, nice teamwork, Professor Kerr, Professor Choi, and Professor Montanari. nominated Sean Hussey, a master's student in CCPA, who exemplifies the way social justice is infused in thought and action among Roosevelt University students. He's worked on numerous projects at Roosevelt and has had a lens toward providing solidarity for refugee communities. He's initiated social justice endeavors across CCPA. The nominators stated of Sean envisions collaborative music making as a socio-political act. His commitment to social justice is exemplary and unparalleled by any other student with whom we've worked. In fact, some years ago, when we envisioned how the Music Conservatory might embody the ideals of social justice, we could not have imagined somebody of the caliber of Sean Hussey. Hussey believes that music is incredibly human and has a powerful voice toward enacting change. He intends to explore this connection for the rest of his life.
Sean, congratulations. The music that you play for the immigrant community and the refugee community brings relief to a world that is being affected by this plague. You know, thank you for what you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really, I had not heard those words before that my professors wrote, and it's really meaningful. So I first want to start by thanking them. And I also want to thank the Mansfield Institute and the Freeman family. I think they really help in instilling, they're an integral part to the moral compassion and the moral imagination of Roosevelt University, and that's so important. I'm also, like Brittany, really humbled by this award, and it's kind of caused me to reflect a little more on the music I write and the intersection of music and social advocacy. I think music is really interesting. It exists in this liminal space, and it's a spectrum of communication. On one hand, it's a really amazing communicator because of its emotional affect. And on the other hand, it's an incredibly poor communicator because it's imprecise and inconsistent. And I love that spectrum. And I think because of this, music has been able to get away, and music institutions have been able to get away with reflecting damaging colonial ideals for a long time. So a couple institutions, I don't want to be unfair, people have addressed this. Roosevelt is an example of that. Also having blind auditions for orchestras has helped a little bit. But there are these outreach programs that exist in music that I think don't quite solve these problems and sell music short of its potential to really enact change in the community. And in my own work, I really try to adjust the way that music is created and build music that is focused on presence and real people and gives room for nuance and moralized issues and hopefully allows audiences to humanize perceived others. I also want to offer today that music is ubiquitous in our culture, and I think that's really amazing. I think it gives power to people who are not only composers or performing artists. And I want to encourage you to think of the music that you consume in this way. Think of the ethical implications of the music that you listen to. Because music is really more than an artifact, and it's more than a product, and it's more than an object, and that's really beautiful. This liminal space that music inhabits is something that we all inhabit ourselves as well. We have the ability to shape that space and change how it performs and allow music to be a tool for connection. Thank you again.
And along with this award, each of these students is going to receive a check for $500. And just really good work, guys. And so we are so happy to have Dr. Janine Love provide remarks before the lecture today. Many of you know Dr. Love, and for those of you that don't, let me do a real quick introduction here. She is a professor of public administration. She teaches courses in management, policy, political theory, and social justice. She's the author of a chapter called Widowed on the 10-Year Track, giving advice for new scholars, and she's blogged about her reflections on widowhood for the Chicagoland Young Widowed Connection. Last October, she and her breast cancer rowing team called Recovery on Water were featured in Athleta's Power of She campaign. So for those of you that wear Athleta, that's our Professor Janine Love. She has co-authored 3 books, Integrative Processes, Radical Democratic Approach to Global Governance, and Integrative Governance. And each of these works considers how we might create a new political economy based on assumptions of radical interconnection. So I welcome Dr. Love to the podium.
Okay. All right, so as Heather said, I've written about a bunch of this stuff, but I haven't actually spoken publicly about it before, so bear with me. Talking about widowhood and cancer, so there is the smallest chance that I could cry. If it happens, no one panic. We'll breathe through it, we'll be okay. So first I want to say I really appreciate Heather and Wendy inviting me here to share my reflections on Wendy Simonds' book, Hospital Land. I don't have a lot of time here, so what I want to try to do in the brief time that I have is first give a little bit about my personal background that I brought to my reading of the book, and then grab on a couple of the themes that stuck out to me and give a quick example of practical application of those. I think both of these are really essential for understanding why this kind of work is so important. So first, the personal. I have a long-standing relationship with Hospital Land. As folks in the room know, a lot of you, I was widowed in 2012 when my partner Art died. He needed a liver transplant, he didn't get it. So he became one of the 20 people who die every day waiting for a transplant. Between the time he was diagnosed in 2004 when he was 25, when he died in 2012 at the age of 34, he was hospitalized 36 times. Some of those were just an overnight stay. Usually they were for several days. Sometimes they were for weeks. Even prior to being diagnosed with liver disease, he had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and Crohn's disease, both of those with their own doctor's appointments, hospitalizations. So throughout the entire 16 years we were together, I basically lived side by side with Arik in Hospital Land. I've spent more days than I could begin to count in waiting rooms, exam rooms, hospital rooms, emergency rooms, ICUs. And I've had to navigate the opaque and emotionally devastating world of end-of-life decisions, followed by the overwhelming grief and isolation of widowhood. Then, after all of that, in 2016, 4 years after Arik's death, I entered into a new relationship with Hospital Land when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. As you might imagine, given the background I've just sketched, the fear that came along with that cancer diagnosis was amplified by the realization that I was going back to Hospital Land. At this point, I've spent 21 years of my life coping with life-threatening illness, death, and grief. In other words, I've spent half my life in Hospital Land. As Simonds explained, Hospital Land is a surreal and exhausting place to exist. And while reading this book, there were 2 themes in particular that stuck out and resonated with my personal experiences. First, how horrible we are as a society when it comes to coping with and talking about death, and this includes folks in the medical community. And second, the myriad ways we seek to hide the realities of disease and death through our cultural practices and cultural texts. And again, the medical community is not exempt in this. What I've seen again and again through my experiences is that we as a society are ill-equipped to deal with disease, death, and grief. A practical example of where these themes come together is in the pinkwashing of breast cancer. When I was first diagnosed, I was taken aback the first time someone reassured me that I had gotten, quote, the good cancer. And then it happened again and again, often followed by, they can treat that now. I really wasn't sure how to respond to this. I mean, I was terrified of my cancer and it felt minimizing, but I also kind of wanted to believe it. And it's only more recently that I started to understand why I think folks might have had this reaction, and it has to do with pink. I was diagnosed at the end of September, which means I was still reeling from that initial diagnosis the first time I got hit with Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Pinktober. Pink everywhere. Pink on the Sears Tower. Pink at Midway Airport. Pink at Garrett's Popcorn. It was really overwhelming and frankly quite baffling. It was so surreal that somehow all of this pink was supposed to represent me and the terrifying disease I was dealing with. And while awareness is all well and good and appreciated, the kind of awareness represented by all this pink can be problematic. It can erase the men who get breast cancer. It can hide the reality that many breast cancers can't be detected in self-exam or mammogram. They are important, please do them, but they're not foolproof. It can minimize the hardships of surgery, chemo, hormone therapy, risks of lymphedema, the realities of living with and through breast cancer. And it throws what some have called the pink shroud over metastatic disease. Metastatic breast cancer is cancer that has spread to other areas of the body. There's a breast cancer tumor in the liver or the lung or the brains or the bone. About 6 to 10% of initial breast cancer diagnoses are stage 4 metastatic. That means the day the person found out they had breast cancer, it had already metastasized. But roughly 30% of those of us who are diagnosed with an earlier stage will develop metastases. We don't have exact numbers for this because why would we count that? But what we do know is that breast cancer kills 108 to 110 people every single day. That's 40,000 people per year. The stats on life expectancy with metastatic disease have remained largely unchanged for 20 years, and currently there is no cure. There isn't even effective treatment to turn metastatic disease into a long-term chronic illness, which is the goal. And despite all of that pink, only 2 to 10% of the money raised goes to fund research to treat metastatic breast cancer, to actually find a cure. But most of us never hear any of this in the pink awareness raising. And the voices of those with metastatic breast cancer are often silenced inside the breast cancer community. I've seen it happen. These are the realities that are largely erased by the pink narrative. Upon reflection, I think all of this has to do with a combination of our social inability to cope with life-threatening illness and death and the cultural practices and stories we create to avoid doing so. Not to mention the gendered nature of breast cancer, and that's a whole different talk. So. Metastatic disease is the breast cancer that kills. Living with it means treatment never ends. The stories folks with metastatic disease have to share are often hard to hear and can be frightening. Metastatic disease reminds us that breast cancer actually doesn't have a cure. It undermines the success stories we crave in our cultural narratives and therefore needs to be eliminated from the pink narrative. But this is not a good cancer. What I want to emphasize with this illustration is that these kinds of narratives, the ones that minimize life-threatening illness, death, grief, are collectively harmful, because the reality is that all of us will face death and grief. As Simonds reminds us, none of us can escape hospital land. So rather than avoiding these realities, I suggest we share our experiences with one another and face illness, death, and grief with open eyes and open hearts. And that we insist that society and the medical community talk openly and honestly about life-threatening illness and death. It's only together, collectively shouldering our fears, anxiety, and grief as family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, patients, and medical providers that we can address the problems Simonds helps highlight and redefine what hospital land means.
So I want to thank you so much, Dr. Love. Thank you. I want to share a few words about Matthew so that you all know who Matthew was as a person. I had the honor of being his professor, and I think, June, you were also his professor. Has anybody else here had Matthew as a student? He was really a bright young man, committed to social justice. And when I had him in class, and I was telling Sean this earlier, he would do this thing where he was just so far ahead in terms of what he was thinking about and processing. And instead of having any arrogance in the way that he approached a topic, he would just get this little smile on his face. And I knew whenever Matthew had that little smile on his face, there was something percolating. And if I called on him, I knew the discussion was going to go in all of these really wonderful directions. And so that's Matthew, and I'm just so pleased to be here and to be able to honor his memory with all of you. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Wendy Simonds, who is the professor of sociology and the graduate director of gerontology at Georgia State in Atlanta. We talked her into coming to Chicago are we in March now? In March, yeah. It's spring in Atlanta, and she's here with us. She is the author of 5 books, well, an editor of 1. So her first book is Abortion at Work, Ideology and Practice in a Feminist Clinic. Next, Women and Self-Help Culture, Reading Between the Lines and State. Next, Centuries of Solace, Expressions of Maternal Grief in Popular Literature, and she's the co-editor of Sex Matters, the Sexuality and Society Reader, in addition to the book that she's here to talk with us about. She is also a past president of the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and it is my pleasure to welcome Wendy Simonds.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather and Janine, and thank you to Roosevelt University and the Freeman family as well. I'm really honored to be here, and I've been telling people I've never given a talk in such a beautiful room before. If anybody wants to come and sit on this floor right here, it's not a problem at all for me, and you can see the slides. So, okay, I'll get started. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how this book came about, and then I'll move into discussing what I call disease disaster narratives that I hope will lead us in the direction of discussing health as a global justice issue. I want to start with 2 basic definitions that I use in the book, medicalization and hospital land. What does it mean to be medicalized? It means to submit to medical authority, to understand one's body, mind, and self through a medical lens. And by through a medical lens, I don't mean that we each come to have the same knowledge that doctors do, but rather that in general, we tend to accept medicalized views on life and death as authoritative, even when we seek second opinions. We tend to accept medicalized approaches to health as definitive and morally right also. In defining medicalization, I expand on Peter Conrad's definition of it as a process by which non-medical problems become defined and treated as medical problems. This definition is problematic, as Barbara Katz-Rothman puts it, because it rests on an assumption that there are distinctly medical and non-medical problems in the first place. Also, the passive construction of Conrad's definition hides the actors, the people and the institutions whose actions impel medicalization. Finally, medicalization is not one clear process. It's a complicated, confusing, tangled web of activity that also affects experiences that are not considered problems. Medicalization changes culture and changes with culture. So I offer this revised definition. I define medicalization as a dynamic set of processes by which medical authorities, institutions, and ideologies come to organize and reorganize, define and redefine, and structure and restructure our everyday experiences, culture, and social life. And though evidence shows that class, which is of course not independent of race, gender, sexual identity, age, and disability status, is the best predictor of living conditions and hence a major determinant of health outcomes, in the US, we are taught to see health problems as emerging from idiosyncratic behaviors. I think this is kind of a Western conception. Either they result from poor health practices or from unlucky genetic inheritance. The political and legislative maneuvers of states, powerful religious institutions, global and local capitalism, and their associated toxins, like the ones I mentioned before, like poverty and classism, racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, in addition to pollution and coerced labor migration, all profoundly impact our health, but we are much more likely to blame individuals than social forces for health problems. Oops, I didn't want to go to that yet. I use the term hospital land to refer to a generalized US medicalized environment, much more than hospitals. So all the different rooms involved in hospitals and all the different centers involved in medical care, treatment facilities, therapy centers, imaging centers, residential care facilities, doctors' offices, clinics, rehabs, and nursing homes. There's probably more. In addition to vast mazes of space, hospital land is endless human movement. Lots of hustle and bustle. And simultaneously, hospital land is full of inertia. people lying on stretchers and in beds, people slumped in chairs, people staring into space, reading magazines, and watching television. This is one of my favorite pictures. I don't know how well you can see from the back, but we were going to turn off this side of lights, right? Can we do that? It might help. But you could see there's like a soap opera on the TV in the hospital waiting room. Hospital land is filled with televisions. It is an alternate universe within the world of the living, focused on the bodily problems that interrupt and that ultimately end life. In hospital land, sickness never ends. Now I wish I had a light right here. There is one, but it's not on. But I'm good. I use the term hospital land ironically, too, to conjure a warped amusement park, amusing in sick ways, if at all. In fact, you will find very little frivolity in hospital land that isn't false or infantilizing. Hospital land is quite like a bad carnival, with a combination of games rigged against you that offer, for the most part, crappy prizes and rides in various stages of dilapidation that pose various degrees of peril to various sorts of riders, interspersed with a few glitzy, high-tech, computerized, super expensive rides. You can't tell which ride will make you feel an exalted sense of movement, which one will throw your back out of whack, which one will make you vomit, or which one will malfunction and kill you. You do know that no matter what, you'll stand in long lines before every ride. Medicalized experiences can be so intense and upsetting, we call them emotional roller coasters. They make us feel that our lives are spinning out of control sometimes. And we might also feel like we're being taken for a ride financially, or in terms of misplaced trust or falsely raised hopes. Almost all of us will visit at one time or another, like Janine said, at least occasionally, as patients or as companions to the afflicted. Some of us will go regularly or constantly to hospital land as patients, companions, or workers. In this country, the vast majority of us, 99%, are born in hospital land, and about 3/4 of us will die there. This statistic does represent an increase in home death, though, from 15 to 24% between 1989 and 2007. So it's getting a little bit better on that count. And many of us will get what ultimately kills us in hospital land. There is some disagreement about the statistics, but no matter how you slice it, hospital land is the third leading cause of death in the United States after heart disease and cancer. Hospital land will likely be the most expensive theme park any of us will ever visit. It is specially designed to drain whatever financial resources we may have. While many people become or remain impoverished as a result of hospital land expenses, at the same time, hospital land corporations become rich. The longer science and medicine, or what I call the other S&M, can keep us alive, the more they and their various associated industries and institutions will profit. And I don't mean to suggest that many practitioners of science and medicine aren't good practitioners or don't have benevolent intent. They do, but the ugly realities of a capitalist industrial structure cannot be erased. This book would not have come about if it had not been for my friendship with Chet Meeks, who was my colleague at Georgia State for 1.5 years before he died in 2008. And that's Chet with my cat, Hinky Punk, who also recently died. He died this past December. Chet's death was 10 years ago. In October 2006, a month after he moved to Atlanta, Chet found out that he had stage 4 colon cancer. Over the course of the next 1.5 years, the last 1.5 years of his life, Chet endured several rounds of chemotherapy at 2 of Emory University's hospitals in Atlanta. 8 months before he died, he underwent unsuccessful major surgery at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. He stopped chemotherapy just 3 weeks before he died. I went with Chet to chemo occasionally in the beginning, and then after a few months, almost always. He would often stay with my family to recover for a couple of days after his infusions every other week. So we spent a lot of time together. While I like to think we all would have become as close to Chet as we did under any circumstances, his cancer certainly sped and intensified this process for everyone who became involved with Chet at the end of his life. We loved each other fast and said so frequently in a way that is not typical of relatively new friendships. In medical lingo, you might say that our relationships with Chet were characterized by accelerated, even aggressive growth. Sometimes he and I spoke very directly about his cancer experiences and eventually his impending death, but mostly we didn't. We developed our own distancing strategies. When we were in medical environments, we usually avoided these subjects except by making jokes. Chet and I would cope with hospital time by mocking whatever we could. We enjoyed many conversations about the absurdities involved in navigating the hospital industrial complex. We talked about how people were processed, routinized, and dehumanized. We intellectualized, in other words, as scholars are wont to do. We invoked Goffman's ideas about total institutions and Foucault's about panoptic surveillance, and we compared doctors' offices and hospitals to other less and more totalitarian institutions that process lots of people in more and less vulnerable situations like airports, prisons, and universities. We dissected the behaviors and words of medical service providers, and we speculated about what it would be like to routinize the pain and suffering and the death of others as one's work every day. We were sarcastic and irreverent. It's hard to maintain your sense of humor in hospital land, but we were pretty good at it. This was a much greater accomplishment for Chet, of course, than for me. I was not suffering or facing death in at all the same way that he was. I was particularly intrigued by the signs in the hospital. One day, I brought my camera, and this is back when cameras were actual cameras, not phones, to take photos of the signs. Each floor had a theme, and that theme appeared on the floors and the walls and hung down from the ceilings in juxtapositions we thought were pretty amazing, like this one. And this one over where people would stand in line to pay. This is my favorite, I think. This is the compassion tunnel. I see the compassion tunnel as a flawless representation of the quintessential indifferent institution. It showcases Hospital Land's claim and ironically highlights its failure to care about us, to treat us with compassion as full people. Often what we experience in Hospital Land is the opposite of compassion, much more in keeping with this empty, desolate bleakness that this tunnel exemplifies. And there are lots of tunnels like this in Hospital Land. I could show you like 6 pictures that look very similar. They don't have the name Compassion Tunnel, though. Chet and I speculated about what the sign should say to actually represent people's lived experiences in Hospital Land. And my son Jake, who's a graphic designer and also designed the cover of the book, which I'm very proud of, made these ideas a reality. Can everybody see? Often these signs don't need photographic manipulation to be ironic, though. And here are a couple of my favorites like that. And this one, in case you can't see it, at the very bottom, there are 2 little, what are those things you throw? Life buoys? Yeah, life preservers, and it says, "Life wins at Winship." This sign, "Forget everything you know about hospital rooms," might be my favorite of all the signs I've collected. On offer is an exclusive, expensive hospital room that will be good for you because it's not like a hospital room. In fact, it's nothing like a hospital room. Hospital Land marketers know we know how bad hospital rooms can be. What they have to offer will make us forget all that. This nothing like a hospital room is in a pavilion, a word that evokes outdoor parks and festivals. The accompanying photos could come straight out of an ad for a boutique hotel or a spa vacation. and then prose in a pamphlet that I found when I was preparing for this talk that I didn't even know I had, offers more details of the pampering available there. I'll read this for you. Amid the peace of the cypress trees, the ancient Greeks built temples where the sick could heal. In the heart of Atlanta, Emory University Hospital has blended this philosophy with the warmth, charm, and grace of Southern hospitality. The Rollins Pavilion welcomes our patients with the ambience found in a luxury hotel. Every detail in architecture, amenities, staffing illustrates our conscientious efforts to make your stay as comfortable as possible. On the front cover, at the bottom is the trademark slogan, advancing the possibilities. We know what it really means. And I have heard of many famous people who come to Atlanta for their surgeries and go in Rollins Pavilion, from a nurse I know who works there. The pamphlet emphasizes the superior, not like hospital features of the pavilion, where specialness awaits in terms of quiet, fancy furnishings, and better, nicer nurses, quote, selected for their professional skills and expertise, and sensitive to individuals from the many cultures that comprise our world. I think this is a way of saying these nurses have been trained to be less xenophobic than nurses in the regular part of the hospital. Nowhere does it say in the pamphlet that you will receive superior medical services in the Rollins Pavilion explicitly, but I think it's very clearly implied. So the first day I brought my camera for the signs, I ended up photographing Chet's entire day. I could tell he liked it. He kept making silly faces, flashing me wry smiles, and calling me Annie, as in Annie Leibovitz. It was almost fun. That day, I felt protected, as if the camera were a shield of some kind, granting me a sort of distance through my scrutiny. And I felt less helpless, even though I was not less helpless. I think my photography gave Chet the illusion of feeling less helpless also. He enjoyed it because it pissed off the nurses. He liked that they felt intruded upon, scrutinized, and objectified, because that was how he always felt there. He liked that we were turning, or at least messing with, the surveillance tables. This is an artisanal kitty mask that I made for Chet. It took me years after Chet died to figure out how to write about everything that had happened, or even if I wanted to. A series of forays into medical environments, mostly as a companion, in the ensuing years after his death, led me to consider how a camera lens and a sociological lens might be combined into a discourse analysis of personal and cultural experiences in hospital land. I had been noticing for years the ways in which hospital land spilled out into public and private spaces, and so I began to look for it more explicitly and to document it more concertedly by taking pictures, and even on occasion I take signs when no one's around. In this book, in addition to writing about my memories about hospital land with Chet and other loved ones, I analyze a variety of cultural manifestations of science and medicine, ranging from fictional to real news stories about epidemics to memoirs by medical professionals, patients, and companions about hospital land experiences, to medical mail, to advertisements in the pages of magazines and in public spaces. And I divide these cultural productions into three thematic categories, each of which has its own approach to medicalization: disease disasters, melodramatic memoirs, and death comedies, which I see as a subset of melodramatic memoirs. They aren't mutually exclusive. Often, cultural productions include elements of all three. These categories just offer a convenient way to look at the messy range of messages about science, medicine, and medicalization that manifest in recent and contemporary U.S. culture. Disease disaster narratives tend to be hyper-dramatic, explicitly gory, suspenseful adventure tales in which hospital land workers battle epidemics that threaten humanity on a large scale. The danger of contagion and terrorism, attacks from without, combine to fuel national and nationalist paranoia in fictional and real disease disaster stories. In contrast, the world of melodramatic memoirs is more insular, domesticated, and feminized. Melodramatic memoirs encourage an intimate identification with sufferers and practitioners in hospital land who recount emotional, even transformative journeys through, and sometimes in opposition to, medicalization. And death comedies are also likely to be personal stories that document transformative journeys, but they stand out from the bulk of melodramatic memoirs because their creators overtly frame or market them as comedic. In death comedies, humor works to soften the potential pain involved in contemplating so much misery and offers a unique approach to subjects not typically considered laughing matters, and also often a wry critique of medicalization. So death comedies are my favorite. They're also kind of the smallest group, but I'm not focusing on them today. I'm focusing on disease disasters, which are probably things that you are familiar with, I think. I think it's interesting to look at disease disasters because I think that the ways in which global health problems are portrayed to us in our own cultural narratives are very telling about our culture. Producers, screenwriters, and directors design disease disaster movies as adventure thrillers for a target audience of young men. They fold in characteristics of other genres too, suspense, crime, spy, mystery, sci-fi, sometimes even a little romance, to create suspenseful medicalized action plots. First, the stage is set, sometimes quite realistically. This film concerns the 4-day history of a major American scientific crisis, the Andromeda strain opening narration announces. Government officials mobilize forces. They collaborate with S&M experts. We watch them confer in front of screens and microscopes with fast-paced music pumping in the background. Some S&M traveling experts meet with national and local officials, others work in labs, and still others go out into the field to investigate. S&M and state authorities discuss the complicated available data, the intransigence of the mysterious disease in question, the possible connections with terrorism, and thus its potentially dangerous effects on international politics. At first, they are completely baffled. If we knew where this thing started, then we'd have a chance at stopping it, explains a doctor in World War Z. They're also alarmed. This is the scariest son of a bitch I've seen, says a doctor in Outbreak. But they rarely doubt their own powers. In 72 hours, we'll know what it is, if we're lucky, says a CDC official in Contagion. We watch the mystery disease develop in graphic, disgusting ways, often involving ugly sores, hemorrhaging, foaming at the mouth, and choking. We see hospitals become overrun with sick people and watch medical workers suit up in hazmat suits to avoid exposure to the disease in question. Some of them always succumb. Typically, we can expect several deaths among the disease-fighting S&M workers, and probably at least one of the main protagonists will die. Even though they're risking their lives, it's often an exhilarating and competitive adventure for these S&M workers. The exponentially growing epidemic raises all sorts of logistical and political challenges that they meet with bravery. Global warfare is always a possibility. In most cases, state authorities suspect the disease could be some kind of a plot of enemies of the United States. The villains in these movies shift with time, echoing whatever xenophobic nationalist anxieties are current when they're made. S&M practitioners and political authorities are often at odds with each other. Political authorities won't listen to S&M advice when they should, and it never works the other way around. On all these movies, people would be much better off if it were the other way around, because though they're not incorruptible or purely altruistic every time, most of the S&M practitioners in these films truly care about saving lives. And in contrast, it's usually crystal clear that the politicians want to control science and medicine out of their own self-interest and hunger for power. State officials often resist quarantine maneuvers or enact them in misguided ways that fuel the epidemic or violent conflict or both. They commonly repress information the public should know, fearing yet feeding mass panic. Whatever they do should have been done sooner or differently. Things go from bad to worse pretty fast. Interpersonal and international politics linked by the spreading epidemic turn catastrophic. Infrastructure and institutional collapse ensue. Roads and airports close. Traffic jams and other forms of mass panic are produced. There's rioting, looting, burglary, rape, torture, and killing, depending on the movie. There are lots of dead bodies in pretty much every movie. People become desperate and brutal. Too often, they become zombies. In addition to scary zombies, there tends to be a lot of gross and violent imagery. The narrator of Doomsday says, social order decayed along with the corpses. The last to die became primal savages, feeding on dogs, rats, and even each other. The news media play a role in most of these films, functioning as a narrator of events or even helping to solve the mystery of the disease disaster by teaming up with S&M forces. They typically serve as a conduit for whatever official information exists to the characters and the audience, though we may have behind-the-scenes knowledge that contradicts much of this news. The media selectively document the developing mayhem, all the while offering paternalistic and inadequate advice. Return to your homes, urges a newscaster in Outbreak. You will be safe there. Scientists have the situation well in hand and are working day and night to find a cure. The bodies of the recently deceased are coming alive and attacking the living, a news reporter intones dispassionately in Shaun of the Dead, which is the only parody I've found in or of this genre. For almost the first half of Shaun of the Dead, we learn about the impending disease disaster from news broadcasts playing in the background to which the main characters pay no attention. They remain stupidly oblivious even as zombies begin to appear right in front of them, and it's pretty funny. And then it gets gross. Near the end of disease disaster films, there's a scientific breakthrough that provides hope. We've located the organism, announces a triumphant scientist in the Andromeda strain, but it could be too late. Getting from an isolated organism to a solution is a gargantuan, complicated, and logistically daunting task. And meanwhile, the epidemic advances. A vaccine would take months, explains a scientist in Contagion. Usually, doctors and scientists are selfless and heroic saviors, like the one in Toxic Skies who says, they're all going to die if I can't find a cure, or the one in I Am Legend who refuses an opportunity to escape the post-apocalyptic zombie land that New York City has become, saying, this is ground zero, this is my site, I'm not leaving, I can still fix this, and then actually does. Often these maverick doctors disregard rules or protocols and put their own lives on the line, doing things like inoculating themselves to test vaccines with this brand new vaccine that hasn't been tested, putting themselves in harm's way by smuggling information or specimens or vaccines to subvert the red tape of governmental policies, or killing zombies or other villains if they must to save the world. Most of the action-adventure segments involve displays of hegemonic masculine heroics, fighting off zombies, for instance, enacted mostly, but not only, by men characters. These butch zombie fighter heroes are also, but not only, mostly young and white. On the research end of things, middle-aged and occasionally old S&M practitioners, like the doctor at the top from the Andromeda strain picture at the top right, who've been called in because of their reputation in past disease disasters. There's often at least one woman and one person of color on the S&M team. These movies typically end with the epidemic waning and the world beginning to recover. They end with hope that humankind, though pared down and traumatized, can live on in the aftermath. Sometimes endings include some conclusive dialogue or voiceover narration describing the emergence of a revitalized new world where altruism or community are possible, but not typically fully realized, like at the end of World War Z, where the narrator says, this isn't the end, not even close. If you can fight, fight. Help each other. Be prepared for anything. Our war has just begun. Paves the way nicely for a sequel, right? In almost all these narratives, S&M workers, usually doctors, appear to offer the only solution to the threatened large-scale social disintegration that epidemics introduce. Essentially, the doctors save the world. These upbeat endings, after a typically tense 2 hours, at least for me they're tense, I don't enjoy these, filled with all kinds of suffering and death, demonstrate S&M victories that point to better times ahead. What about when the disease disasters are real? Since the spring of 2014, when the outbreak began, I read news stories about Ebola in the New York Times. These descriptions from that fall sound like they could be lifted straight out of a screenplay for a disease disaster movie. Here are some quotes from stories that I collected. 2 men wearing yellow protective suits and thick rubber gloves left the clinic carrying a body bag on a stretcher. As they walked through a tropical forest filled with birdsong, another man followed behind, spraying the dirt path until the brown leaves glistened with the bleach solution. They were burying a 38-year-old man. The first to respond to the Ebola crisis in West Africa, Doctors Without Borders, remains the primary international medical aid group battling the disease there. As local health systems have all but collapsed, and most outside institutions, including the United States military, have yet to fulfill all their pledges of help, the charity has erected 6 treatment centers in West Africa with plans for more. The first time Dr. Stephen Hatch suited up in protective gear at an Ebola treatment center, he was confronted with the weight of his decision to volunteer here. A patient, sweating and heavily soiled, had collapsed in a corridor. Literally every surface of his body was covered in billions of particles of Ebola, he recalled. And this is Hatch apparently rescuing a child. A nurse who works for Bellevue, where the first Ebola patient in New York was being treated, said her beautician refused to cut her hair because of where she worked. And on the subway, she overheard 2 passengers say they were horrified by Ebola and joke that it would soon turn people into zombies. As occurs in many fictional disease disasters, the response of the world to Ebola in Africa was too little and too late. A New York Times article from April 2015 states, only 28 Ebola patients have been treated at the 11 treatment units built by the United States military, American officials now say. 9 centers have never had a single Ebola patient. An unprecedented number of people, over 11,300 in 6 countries, died in that Ebola epidemic. In US culture, real disease disasters are never completely dissociated from fictional ones, and vice versa. Real and fictional disease disaster stories even may market each other to the general public as if they are doing a public service, all in the while fanning our fears of disease disasters. And this was the case with the 2011 film Contagion, in which collaboration among creators of real and fictional S&M was extensive and reciprocal. Movie stars from Contagion visited the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta to see what it was really like, where real epidemiologists work in real life. CDC officials served as consultants on Contagion and went on the publicity circuit like real movie stars do when they are promoting a fictional movie. CDC added a Contagion section on its webpage titled CDC Responds to Contagion. CDC works for you 24/7. Which repeatedly attested to the veracity of Contagion's representation, all the while promoting the even more real world of actual 24/7 CDC S&M work. Website visitors could vicariously be part of this thrilling work. The invitation on this page said, "You've heard about Contagion. Now get the facts about outbreak investigations from real-life CDC disease detectives. Join CDC expert Dr. Jennifer McQuiston for a live Twitter chat to learn firsthand how CDC investigates deadly diseases and protects against their spread. Talk with some of CDC's epidemic intelligence service officers. Kate Winslet played one in Contagion. Learn more about what it's really like to be an EIS officer." So this exact website no longer exists, and at the time I was like too stupid to realize that websites went away, but parts of it sort of do remain there. So like if you go on CDC website, I don't know if you can read this, but it says CDC's disease detectives, global health sleuths battle contagion worldwide. And then there is still a little part on the movie with a picture of an actual person who is from Africa, right? A live person. While I was virtually participating in actual CDC adventures, I got invited to donate money to support its work too. The Contagion movie trailer was a click away too. Donate money to save real people whose countries are being ravaged by real epidemics, and then lickety-split, click, 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 buy a movie ticket to watch a fictional epidemic. Website visitors could thus move back and forth between Contagion's depiction of the CDC and the CDC's self-congratulatory representation of itself and of Contagion, endlessly pondering the intersections between real and fictional governments, real and fictional economic systems, real and fictional social media activism, real and fictional S&M workers investigating real and fictional epidemics and their ensuing real and fictional aftermaths. On Halloween night of 2014, around this time, I was sitting at my dining room table waiting for trick-or-treaters and reading through the New York Times from the past week, and an ad for an organization called Doctors of the World jumped out at me. So on the one side I have like a sort of close-up of it, and then the whole page, and I don't know if you can see it well, but there's real story of Ebola next to the ad for Doctors of the World. So the copy reads, here it's a costume, there it saves lives. And in smaller print, the ad continues, help Doctors of the World fight Ebola. Donate a real Ebola suit at morethanAcostume.com. This Doctor of the World is androgynous and white. At the bottom of the page in very tiny letters is a statement, donors will be making an unrestricted financial contribution to Doctors of the World's Ebola emergency response. I wondered why the ad said I could donate a real Ebola suit, yet it reneges on this promise in the small print. I also wondered, are hazmat suits now really going to be called Ebola suits? Is there something Ebola specific about this suit that distinguishes it from other protective gear worn in highly infectious settings? And then, of course, I wonder, will people really be dressing up in Ebola suits as costumes for Halloween? No, Ebola-suited faux Doctors of the World came to my door that night, and they asked a few other people. They didn't see any either. On the Doctors of the World website, I learned that I don't have to donate a whole Ebola suit. I could choose gloves for $1, goggles for $10, the body part of the suit for $250, a hood for $500, etc. If I were feeling particularly generous, I could even donate a doctor for $2,500. Really, at that price, I thought I should get one or two to keep around the house. However, again, in tiny print, there's the stipulation that my donation will be unrestricted. Why pretend I can buy this stuff in the first place? I think it's a gimmick to make potential donors feel that we can actually contribute real items, and in so doing feel as though we are contributing to saving real lives. The objects thus represent our concern for real, live, suffering others made tangible, and yet we do not see these suffering others like we do in the New York Times stories. We see only doctors, and we can't even see these doctors' faces. In this way, the ad also invites us to imagine ourselves in the real Ebola suit, saving real lives in a kind of virtual way without having to actually go to medical school or leave our homes. So a week later, I received a mailing from Doctors Without Borders that also includes apparent commodities for purchase and donation, but it doesn't say my donation is unrestricted. This Ebola protective gear costs $100, a bargain compared to the suit on offer, but not really, from Doctors of the World, and the third most expensive item on the list, following life-saving treatment for 36 young children suffering from malaria for $35, and medication to prevent and treat life-threatening hemorrhages in 116 new mothers for $75, only 65 cents per mother. Doctors Without Borders enclosed a large fold-out world map. Across the top of it, it said, "We find out where the conditions are the worst, the places where others are not going, and that's where we want to be," in red letters. And under the map, it says, "Our response depends on your response." On the enclosed donation form is the slogan, "It takes you to help us save lives." So again, by donating, I can symbolically be where others are not going without actually going myself. I can decide whether or not to spend. And if I decide not to, lives will not be saved. My inaction will produce death. This unspoken message of the generosity solves disease disaster narrative undergirds a lot of hospital land fundraising campaigns. Here's another example of the same sort of rhetoric on the Doctors Without Borders website, because I also unthinkingly did not save this map. And I don't mean to suggest that these causes are not worthy. I also don't mean to suggest that providing medical services to people in need or that donating to causes that supply these services are bad ideas. These are complicated enterprises, rife with imperialist politics and genuine altruistic spirit, too. My objections are about the medicalized worldview presented here. These promotional materials portray vast global social inequalities as individually reparable through donations of imported medicalization. They package disease disasters as charitable imperatives, salvation for typically impoverished Black and brown others, funded by typically wealthy white Western donors and based on Western capitalistic scientific and medical expertise. I'm disturbed by the rhetorical strategy of linking hope, health, life, and money as if these should be seen as interchangeable commodities. These ads promise that we can purchase hope and secure longer life and less suffering for people whose health is compromised by living in poverty or in war-torn and disease disaster-stricken countries. We can do so much with so little of our money. Their lives are so cheap to save, unlike ours, the ads suggest, but never explicitly state. This rescue narrative obscures the inequities in global health that hospital land industries and global capitalism perpetuate. Doctors Without Borders stresses its independence from any and all governments, suggesting that its lack of state ties make it impartial. The notion that public health measures ought to be funded by ordinary people rather than governments fits perfectly with this independence. But charity is not a financially feasible plan for solving problems of such epic and epidemic proportion. Access to medical services like vaccinations and treatments for infectious disease are a matter of social justice. So is access to nurturing, respectful treatment in hospital land. Real and fictional disease disaster narratives may depict some global inequalities in medical service provision, but they don't really offer a critique. They don't encourage a social justice orientation to health problems and argue, for instance, that rich states should assist poor states in establishing basic medical services along with ensuring clean water and healthy food. And these are the elements that are really essential to fostering public health. But fictional and real disease disasters trade mainly in fear-mongering and Western scientific and medical savior narratives. I think that taking a critical view toward experiences in and representations of hospital land is one step on the way toward demanding social justice in global public health. So thank you so much for coming today.
Yeah.
You can put the lights back on for Q&A if you want.
So we have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I've got a mic here, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and I will come to you.
Hello.
Hi.
So you mentioned a couple times throughout media and fear-mongering, that kind of aspect to this. I know specifically with the flu season that's been going around, at least from what news you can get, it's more of a moderately severe one, but not the worst that we've ever seen. But every time you would turn on the news, it would seem that it was panic. You know, you couldn't help but look at it and think it is very fear-mongering itself. And now that they say that, oh, it's gone, we've seen the end of it, it's in the decline, is there a way that this could be fixed or changed to avoid issues? Because I firmly believe that when we do this, though a lot of these stories focus on victims, it does ignore the facts, what can be done, and what should be said about it. So I guess what I'm asking is, what's the best way that we can open up this conversation, especially with the media?
I mean, I think having a critical view is just super important, but I don't think we can change the media's approach, right? Which is to sell this, and fear sells. Like I think the same things that sell tickets to those sorts of movies sells newspapers, or people look at newspapers because these stories have a kind of titillating adventure focus to them. And I mean, something about, I don't exactly understand what the thrill is of that, but I understand what it's like to not be able to turn away, right? So I don't think we fix it by, I don't think there's a way to just take it down, but I think being critical about it and seeing representations in this way, trying to think about like, what is the power dynamic being presented here? What is really going on? Which may take some fun out of these movies, if you like the fictional versions. But I think we have to sort of interrogate the news that we're given as well, and like, why does it look like this, and what fears are being fanned. I mean, and it just goes from one to the other, so I don't know what the next one is. But right after Ebola was Zika, right? But when's the last time you saw a story about Zika? And Zika was pretty interesting because they were telling women not to get pregnant in South America and Central America. Don't get pregnant for 2 years. The CDC put that out as a recommendation. That's crazy.
Oh, yeah, so my question is what's your opinion of single payer, and what's your opinion on like how nationalized healthcare, well, it seems like hospital land, a lot of it has to do with the private industry.
Yeah, we
so
need it. We
more,
need nationalized healthcare. We're moving away from it right now, but I mean, we need that. And it's very hard to think about how to make things better without that. I mean, I think there are some ways we could, but that is really what we need, and that will help a lot. I mean, that doesn't necessarily make medical services caring, but it makes them accessible.
is there a difference between like countries that when they nationalize their insurance and keep hospitals and doctors private compared to countries like the UK, which nationalize everything?
Is there a difference?
Do you notice?
So this is, I mean, I explicitly call this Hospital Land USA because I don't have really a lot of experience with international hospitals. I would love to do like Hospital Land World, and I think hospitals vary so tremendously around the world. I mean, some hospitals in some parts of the country are still really pretty awful places where you mainly go to die if you can get there at all. And then some countries, I think, are doing a lot better job of providing care through a single payer or state provided insurance. Heather's got the mic, so I'm not calling on anybody.
You talked about the media's portrayal of disease and how they sort of respond to it and report on it. I understood what you were saying, but at the same time, I remember when Ebola was more in the news, I remember reading a lot of journalists discussing how they did purposely write their reporting to be compelling, kind of like a screenplay, because otherwise people weren't going to pay attention. They needed it to be like this, like blow-by-blow account where it's like short and sweet and just interesting. And they understand that might not be the most humanizing way to depict what's going on, but it is the way to get people to pay attention and hopefully keep attention for long enough to do something about it. And so when it comes to, like you were talking about, you want essential changes, I would assume like involving the state and the government through like policy changes, like to, instead of just doing this like as like a, something happens and then people donate, something happens, people donate. Why don't we just have like a foundation in our government, sort of just ensuring that always happens? That's fine, but when it comes to people like Doctors Without Borders, and the journalists, it's not really within their arena to be working on the policy that will help them do more of what you're talking about. So I feel like all they really can do is kind of what they're doing. So I get like why you're criticizing it, but I don't think they're necessarily doing it purely for sensationalism or ratings.
Oh, I agree, yeah. I really appreciate your comment. I mean, I think you're exactly right.
But with that, is there like a middle ground? Like could people like journalists and Doctors Without Borders, could they get involved in, policy and like policy change,
Well, I think Doctors Without Borders can't, right, because of the way that it's structured. But, I mean, I think that there are ways of reporting that could also include the kind of sensational aspects that attract readers, as well as some reporting on the international conditions more and how, how this groundwork was laid, that we have to sort of import solutions from the western part of the world or the global north to the global south when these things happen. I don't criticize it to say, like, I don't mean my criticism to say like this, none of this should exist, but we need to look at like the messages that are there. So, I mean, my goal is not to get rid of it, but my goal would, of course, in the long run be that we do things differently. But I think I'm more on the end of like showing what it looks like and what are the underlying messages than trying to solve the problems of global health, right? Like I can't do that.
It's one of the problems of hospital land. It doesn't talk about the environmental pollution, environmental destruction, and climate change, which in essence it brings about many of the spread of infectious diseases and some of the chronic conditions like cancers and heart disease that would not have occurred.
Right, you're right. Definitely true that environmental factors play a large role in spreading disease and creating new diseases. You're absolutely right. Thank you.
So like you, I do see a lot of like interesting themes going on in like movies where like you see like mass incarceration happening and like it's kind of like poke fun at, so like we don't really like kind of address the situation. So I guess my question is like, what is the role of creatives when we clearly are able to connect social issues and tragedies into movies that glamorize horrific life experiences?
Wow, I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. That's a really good question. I'm stumped.
Okay, so my second question is like, how is it that even as we pay to see like these disease disasters, that fantasy, which often mimics reality, that we're not translating that into questioning like government officials into policy changes?
Why don't we?
Yeah, why don't we?
Why don't we? I mean, I think they're structured to sort of reinforce that we shouldn't, right? Like they're not really structured to make us think that way. So that'd be awesome if they could be, like if there could be like a different kind of way of representing it that would really be critical. I haven't seen it in this genre. The closest is Shaun of the Dead, which starts out hilarious and then just gets stupid and bloody and it doesn't really have a political point to it. But these movies aren't really made to have a political point either. So I think it's fun to try to see what is going on politically in places where the goal is not really about that, because everything is political, like what you were saying with your first question. I mean, everything is political, and so cultures create narratives. I mean, it's not that heavy-handed, but it's not that directional, but cultures create narratives to reinforce the status quo, right?
I think that they are political. Well, first
Well, they are, but they aren't.
That was the first thing I want to say. And what really struck me and stood out, which is related, I think, is that all of the disaster movies that you talked about, government's the enemy, right? Government's the bad guy. Government is what stops these heroes from doing the right things. And so, if that's our narrative,
right,
then we're not going to look to government for a solution, which means
that's a really good point, June.
We're not going to look at public policy.
Yeah.
Right, you know, government
Right. It's problematic, yeah, in the movies, yeah, that's a really good point.
And the way that we think about it in general these days is, well, it's easy to think about government as a bad guy today, but you know, we look to capitalism to save us. We look to individual heroes to save us.
Yeah, and so these movies definitely do set it up like there's this, you know, this butch heroic guy, or a team of them, and they are going to help us. They are going to save us.
So would you say, like, with like the media and the movies and everything, it kind of glamorizes and glorifies like the science and medical industries? And then, like, I read an article one time, I can't remember where in Europe it is. I want to say it's like a town in Switzerland or something like that, where they were talking about how they've basically eradicated Down syndrome with like their like medical practices and stuff like that, which I feel like, I don't know, kind of expresses this kind of God complex of like the medical industry and how they can really affect everything. But like, I don't know, it's just kind of interesting to see that.
The only way I think that Down syndrome could be eliminated would be through prenatal testing and selective abortion. So it's interesting that that would be triumphed as like the end of Down syndrome, because it's not the end of Down syndrome, it's the end of people being born with Down syndrome, right? Weird, yeah.
So we have time for one more question, and another class starts at 12:30, which is what the Exodus has been about. We have one more question?
We had a couple comments about the film industry and how, you know, they'll portray these kind of situations. I guess, would de-establishing the status quo be our first step?
That would be a good first step, wouldn't it? I'm for that. Yeah.
The thought I was, you know,
I want that on a T-shirt. De-establish the status quo.
I know you have the movies like Contagion, whatnot. I remember I watched an episode of South Park. It's, you know, when you hear that name, you think, oh, stupid humor. One of the episodes talked about how doctors managed to liquefy money, and that would cure every disease. And they'll have an episode like that, and in the same breath, they'll talk about stem cell research and having all of Congress sing in the heat of the moment to like agree with each other. You know, this unrealistic, you know, oh, we'll work together and we'll solve this. And it highlights these issues.
Right.
So, especially with the death comedy, which is, you know, a very juxtaposing subject. But I believe, and I guess what I'm trying to ask is, if we put emphasis on these, where we look at what reality is and we question reality at the same time, will that cause a tangible effect?
I hope so. I hope so.
So thank you, Dr. Simonds.
Thank you for coming.
And thank you all for coming.